So we're talking about Earth's atmosphere, and I want to point out that it's not really static. The atmosphere changes, the planet changes. We've talked earlier about how the interior of the Earth is moving around, and you get plate tectonics, the surface moves around, and that changes things. When you change all that land mass, all the continents, and move them around, clump them together, break them apart, and so forth, that's going to change some things around the surface of the Earth. Well, what about the atmosphere? Does that change? And the answer is yeah, the atmosphere changes as well. The Earth's atmosphere, most likely, when it first formed, was what we call the primordial atmosphere. This first atmosphere that it had was most likely the sort of stuff you find in the propylid, the cloud of dust and gas that makes up the the region of the solar system as the planets were forming. And so there's a lot of hydrogen, helium in there. Earth probably had some hydrogen and helium when it formed. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, water vapor, all these sort of things here are going to be parts of what make up the Earth. And so what you've got is this primordial atmosphere. Now, we've already indicated that hydrogen and helium are not going to be stable in the atmosphere because the Earth does not have enough gravity to hold on to them. So they're not stable, so they will go away. They will leave over time. And that would leave us carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Volcanic eruptions and so forth releases some carbon dioxide. Lots of carbon dioxide on Earth is actually released in volcanic eruptions. Nitrogen is trapped in the Earth. That's released in volcanic eruptions as well. So we call this outgassing. So this outgassing produces the carbon dioxide and nitrogen, and some water vapor is there as well. Now, what's going to happen, though, is the hydrogen and helium will leave behind a CO2 and nitrogen atmosphere. Now, that's pretty much the atmosphere that you find on Venus right now. But on Earth, we also are going to have comets delivering water. Now, deliver water to Venus, too, but Venus is closer to the sun, so you actually probably get fewer impacts from that. Earth being a little further may have had a little more water to begin with. At any rate, it's also cooler than Venus would be, and so it maintains some of this water. And so what happens is that this water is out there, and two things happen. One, all this CO2 in the atmosphere, because we have liquid water, the motion of the air, the weather churns the water a little bit and stirs things up. The Coriolis effect also works in the oceans, causing ocean currents, and so it stirs up the water. The CO2 dissolves into the water. The oceans are carbonated. All you have to do is go to the ocean and watch a wave come in, and it fizzes just like when you open a Coke. The oceans are carbonated, so a lot of CO2 is dissolved into the oceans. Now this does a couple of things. For one thing, it makes the oceans slightly acidic, the CO2 dissolved in the oceans, but it also provides a giant reservoir to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the other major thing that happened on Earth that did not happen on other planets is that we've got biological activity. Plants. We have biological activity that, photosynthesis that takes sunlight, uses the energy of sunlight to break apart carbon dioxide. Okay, the carbon is used by the plant, okay, and the oxygen is actually a waste product and it's released. And so that releases into the atmosphere. And so sufficient biological activity keeps producing this oxygen waste, and that builds up in the atmosphere. You end up with less and less CO2 and more oxygen. The nitrogen really doesn't do much. It's just along for the ride. And so what will happen is the atmosphere is going to gradually change until you end up with an atmosphere that has large amounts of nitrogen and oxygen. Now, in the oceans down here, a lot of this carbon dioxide in there is going to precipitate out as carbonate type rocks. So think limestone type stuff. And so this is changing the nature of the planet, because now we're changing the atmosphere. Now it's very important, we're changing the nature of the atmosphere, and we're pumping oxygen into the atmosphere. So the oxygen going into the atmosphere actually changes things. Oxygen is a very reactive and very chemically active material. And so what happens is this is going to actually start changing things. Prior to the oxygenation of the atmosphere, we probably had a lot more elemental or plain iron near the surface of the earth. Iron ore, iron crystals, iron this, basalt type rocks bringing iron to the surface. Oxygen is going to mix with that, and now it's going to change it. Rust, okay, limonite, things of that sort, which are iron-bearing sort of things. So iron-bearing minerals, and so we have this big change here. That's where the red rocks you sometimes see come from, and so it's from the iron oxides. Oxygen is also toxic. It's in fact that's some cities, instead of chlorinating water, they oxygenate the water to kill microbes. OxyClean, it kills. I mean, it again, hydrogen peroxide, used as an aseptic. Oxygen can kill. Too much oxygen is bad for you. Too much oxygen can cause cancer. You've heard about antioxidants in the blood. Okay, too much oxygen can cause cataracts. So, which always, oxygen, can cause wrinkles. Oxygen's bad for you. Too much oxygen is bad for you. Obviously, you need oxygen to live, so too little oxygen is also bad for you with the right amount. What's the right amount? Well, the atmosphere's, your body is designed for 20% oxygen. So too less, that's a problem. Too much, that's a problem. Which always, amazes me that the celebrities a number of years ago were popularizing this trend of oxygen bars and sleeping in oxygen, rich oxygen environments, because they thought, well, some oxygen is good for you, so more is better. It's like, well, that's what not knowing science does for you. Okay, so it turns out it's not good for you to have too much. So, in fact, what happened is some of the first organisms that started producing oxygen, and again, I call them plants. Biologists like fuss at me when I call them plants. It's cyanobacteria and precursors to that. So they're not really plants, which are multicellular things. They're single-cell organisms that they were photosynthesizing, not necessarily using the exact sort of chlorophyll that we have today, but they were photosynthesizing. And so what happened, though, is that as the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere started increasing, so here's a graphic here that shows, time progressing this way and the amount of oxygen increasing as we go, it started killing off some of the early organisms. So there were some things that were living on Earth that cannot live on Earth today because the oxygen would kill them. On the other hand, once we get enough oxygen in the atmosphere, then other organisms come along that actually start utilizing that oxygen. So, for example, animals. The animals, rather than photosynthesizing, they use the waste product of the plants and use that as an energy source. And so this is a change in the atmosphere that occurs due to life. So not necessarily just humans, but life. And so what happens is that the biosphere, or the life on Earth, has dramatically altered the planet. It's dramatically altered the planet climatologically. It's dramatically altered the planet environmentally, or whether that's related to the climatological, it's environment, even just physically. The kinds of rocks that you get have changed because of what life has done. And so this is actually a NASA graphic here showing, concentration of chlorophyll. And so this shows you the parts of the earth where you have vast amounts of chlorophyll. These are the regions here where you have all this plant life here. There's actually a lot of chlorophyll out in the oceans too, plankton and so forth out there. And so these are places where you are actively photosynthesizing, converting CO2 into oxygen. And that's very important. Okay. That changes the climate. All this oxygen changes the climate. The plants change the climate. And in fact, what happens to the plants on one part of the planet actually affects the lack of plants on another part of the planet. And so if you change the plant life in one place, you're going to change the weather pattern, which changes the climate, which changes where it rains elsewhere. And so, again, life has had a dramatic impact on our planet. This is actually one of the things we look for when we are thinking about looking at exoplanets, is if we ever get a chance to actually measure the composition of the atmosphere. A composition of the atmosphere that's very rich in oxygen would be very suggestive that you've got some kind of plant life there. Well, if you've got plant life, you might have other kind of life.